On the night of July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11's lunar module touched down onto the moon at 8:17 p.m. EST. The pilot and the mission commander stepped out onto the almost gravityless moon less than a minute later. The engineers that manned the mission cheered at the new achievement. The moonwalk was televised, and 600 million people, astonished, marveled at what they saw before them. This day would go on to become one of the happiest and most successful days in American history. However, it wasn't all glory in these missions. The US, at the time, certainly considered the Apollo program to be a vital showcase in the propaganda war with the Soviet Union. The Soviets had already launched the first artificial man-made satellite, Sputnik 1, into space during 1957, which meant that the United States was already behind and needed to catch up. At the time, it was also considered important to show that the US was technologically superior to the USSR in order to convince other countries they would be better off allied with the US. This started the space race. The one country that supposedly won would be considered technologically superior. Soon after, America set the goal of getting man onto the moon. But before NASA could focus their efforts on getting to the moon, they needed to learn about how it could actually be done. The Mercury project was started, and it was designed to carry astronauts up to space, showing the world that astronauts could stay in space. The Gemini program was launched to test all aspects of space travel. The resulting data taught NASA what they needed to know to safely send an astronaut into space. Finally, after gathering all they could from the program, NASA decided it was time to get man onto the moon. For ages, the world had been wanting and waiting, and now it would finally be done. Throughout the massive Gemini program, no lives had been lost. However, in 1966, NASA had suffered its first major loss in space equipment. Apollo 1 started normally. All 3 astronauts were finishing their multiple week-long preparation. When Colonel Grissom was asked if the possibilities of a catastrophic failure worried him, he replied saying that the conquest of space is worth the risk of life. During a pre-flight test for the mission, a fire broke out in the main capsule of the huge rocket. All 3 astronauts in the rocket died: Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The tragedy of the accident was still felt a year later. NASA was really considering whether to shut down the Apollo program, and if there was going to be any real Apollo 1. The space program was also perceived by many as a waste of money, and the certainty of its completion by the preset 1970 deadline was questionable due to a lack of funding. But with high hopes and determination for future success, NASA kept going. After all, failure just wasn't an option. NASA had conducted several tests for the newly built Saturn 1B rocket dating back to the launch of Apollo 1. 2 of them, known as AS-203 and AS-202, became known as Apollos 2 and 3, respectively. However, the malfunctions during Apollo 1 let NASA know that there were faults in the rocket, and as a result, they needed to develop new, safer rockets to be used. Hoping to minimize damage, NASA planned a mission that was unmanned and totally computer-controlled, which became to be known as Apollo 4. NASA then launched Apollo 5 to simulate the course of the lunar module. The lunar module circled the globe for 6.5 hours, while the ground station signaled ignition on 2 of its engines to test landing and going up for the trip back home. The use of computers to control the flight was tested during Apollo 6, which allowed for astronauts to have more freedom over the spacecraft. Moving on to Apollo 7, NASA initially sent the astronaut crew into low Earth orbit to test the service and command module, live broadcasts from space, as well as the connection of both the lunar module and its command module, as well as 2 spacecrafts. Goals initially set during Apollo 1 had been successfully completed, a triumph for America and the space program. NASA went on to Apollo 8, and the rocket became the first manned spacecraft to leave low Earth orbit, reach the moon, orbit it, and return. The 3 astronaut crew was also the first to witness and photograph an Earthrise and to escape the gravity of a celestial body. What had been done by Apollo 8 while in lunar orbit had never been done or seen before. Apollo 9 was the 3rd crewed mission in the Apollo space program, and the first flight of the command and service module with the Apollo lunar module. The crew spent 10 days in low Earth orbit, testing several systems critical to landing on the moon, including the LM engines, backpack life support systems, navigation systems, and docking maneuvers. Apollo 10 was the fourth manned mission and the second to orbit the moon. The mission tested all the components needed to land on the moon and safely return to Earth. For all the 8 hours the two astronauts spent inside the lunar module, they steered across hills, rills, and plains on the moon. Though they came very close to the lunar surface, the crew never landed on the moon. The data that was collected helped ready the astronauts for Apollo 11. Apollo 11 was the first mission to have astronauts land on the moon. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first ones to step onto the moon, while Michael Collins stayed behind in the command module. Launching from Cape Kennedy at 1:32 p.m., the crew reached orbit and immediately set off for the moon. Their lunar module, the Eagle, touched down onto the moon, and the astronauts set off collecting lunar samples and performing many tests and experiments that were vital to learn more about the moon and its origin. The initial goal of landing on the moon had finally been accomplished, and on top of that, a year early. NASA then moved on to Apollo 12. The crew performed just over 1 day and 7 hours of lunar surface activity, while Command Module pilot Richard F. Gordon Jr. remained in lunar orbit. An extensive series of exploration tasks was done during the mission. The Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments package was used to gather seismic, scientific, and engineering data throughout a long period of time. Other Apollo 12 objectives included lunar inspections, samplings in landing areas, development of techniques for precision landing capabilities, and further evaluations of the human capability to work in the lunar environment for a prolonged period of time. But their triumph was short-lived.
Houston, we have a problem.
Tragedy struck during Apollo 13, which was the seventh manned mission in the Apollo space program, and the third intended to land on the moon. The crew consisted of Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. The craft was launched on April 11, 1970, from Kennedy Space Center, Florida. However, after about 56 hours, the pressure building up in cryogenic oxygen tank 1, upon which the command module depended on, became unusually high, and within 100 seconds it lost pressure, and communication was lost. However, Tank 2 could be maintained and in use for another 2 hours. The lunar module was used as a lifeboat, and the crew returned to Earth on April 17, 1970. Although they simply wanted to forget about it, NASA soon understood what they could learn from the failed mission. After NASA had understood and fixed the mistakes of Apollo 13, they launched Apollo 14. It was the last to stay on the moon to perform moonwalks and lunar EVAs. After being launched from Kennedy Space Center on January 31, 1971, the spacecraft went into lunar orbit at about 82 hours. The objectives of the mission were to investigate the lunar surface near a pre-selected point in the Fra Mauro Formation and deploy and activate an Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments package. Apollo 15 was the first mission with the longer stay on the moon and a greater focus on science than earlier landings. Apollo 15 was the first to use the lunar roving vehicle, which allowed them to explore the Hadley Apennine region. The astronauts' main goal was to collect samples from the low dark plains, the Apennine highlands, and the area along the Hadley Rail, a long, narrow, winding valley. Apollo 16 was the first mission to land in the lunar highlands. This mission was sent to explore the Descartes Highlands on the moon, previously unexplored. The exercise was also conducted to show the geographic similarities between the Earth and its moon. Scientists were surprised to find high meteorite bombardment, greater than expected lunar magnetism, and lava flow on the far side. Apollo 17 was the final mission of NASA's Apollo program, where they landed on the moon. It had a duration of 12.6 days, with 75 hours spent on the moon. Some objectives included geological surveying and sampling of materials and surface features in a pre-selected area of the Taurus Littrow region, and deploying and activating a surface experiments package. They covered about 35 kilometers of land in total. Despite its ups and downs, Apollo's end result was a huge triumph for the nation and humanity as a whole. The ultimate triumph would not have been possible without the determination and creativity of NASA. While also winning the unofficial space race, the program showcased the technological superiority of the US over the Soviet Union. Much of what we now know about space can somehow be traced back to the Apollo missions.
It's one small step for man, one Dial please for me, okay.